I could probably say honestly that when I was growing up, I had no appreciation for the greatness, the beauty, the majesty of the Mass, because it just wasn't being taught at that time. And I can't remember ever hearing anything from the pulpit in those days that would make me understand what the Mass is all about and who it is we were receiving in Holy Communion. And I kind of feel like for all those years, I, along with so many other millions of Catholic young people, were cheated. You know, we were deprived of the most beautiful, sublime truths of our faith. I was one of those kids growing up that went to Mass probably only because my parents made me go. I had no appreciation for it at all, but now, once I found out what the Mass was all about, see where I am. Today I'm a priest. But again, that's the awesome reality the Mass is. What most people remembered most about Padre Pio, what had the most lasting, profound effect upon them, what touched their hearts more than anything else, was the unforgettable way that he offered the Mass. The pilgrims who saw Padre Pio could never forget the reverence, the devotion, the concentration, the passionate intensity that they saw in his eyes. You know, when you saw Padre Pio elevate that sacred host at Mass, you knew, you understood that you were seeing the greatest, the most powerful, the most awesome, the most sacred thing that takes place in the face of the earth. In my room back home, in my cell, of course, the rooms in the monasteries, an old monastery would be called a cell. Right? There is a large color picture of Padre Pio elevating the chalice at Mass, you know, and whenever I see that picture, it reminds me every day of what I'm doing when I stand in the place of Christ at that altar, offering the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Remember that Padre Pio said, it would be easier for the world to exist without the sun than without the Mass. St. John Chrysostom had a great quotation. He said, it's important to understand that when you see the priest at the altar offering Mass, you are seeing the hand of Christ invisibly extended. We can also talk about the particular effects of the Mass. These are the spiritual fruits that are produced by the individual's devout, reverent participation, heart and soul, in the reception of Holy Communion. To do that effectively, I think, takes a lot of preparation. You know, one of the big problems that we have is that before Mass begins in so many parishes, you see people will be talking, joking, laughing, socializing, carrying on as if our Lord was not even there in the tabernacle. It's obvious. The loss of faith in the real presence is just manifested by the fact that so many people don't even bother to genuflect anymore when they come into their churches. This is a tragedy, because at that moment, they should be making preparation to have an efficacious reception of Holy Communion. Many graces are lost if the people don't make a very prayerful, reflective preparation before Mass begins. And the same goes with Thanksgiving, too. You know, St. Alphonsus Liguori used to say that a great source of the loss of grace for many people is the fact that they fail to make an adequate Thanksgiving when Mass is ended, after they've received Holy Communion. Right? St. Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, says, a person should examine himself, and so eat the bread and drink the cup. The man who eats and drinks without recognizing, without discerning the body, eats and drinks judgment on himself. You see, we're supposed to examine ourselves. That means examine our consciences to be sure that we're not receiving our Lord in a state of grave sin, making a sacrilegious communion. This is something that is hardly ever taught from our pulpits today. And of course, you know, when you look at the link between the penitential rite and the Gloria, and the Mass itself, of course, you have to recognize the link between the Sacrament of Penance and the Holy Eucharist. You see? One follows from the other. I remember being in so many parishes where I found they would have confession scheduled for about 15 minutes before the Saturday Vigil Mass begins. These would be parishes of 1,500, 2,000 families. You might hear 3 or 4 confessions, and maybe 2,000 people receive Holy Communion that weekend. Well, what do we discern from that? Either you have many people ready for canonization, or you have many sacrilegious communions. All right? So people have to be conscious of this, the great necessity of being always in the state of grace. And of course, striving for holiness of life means not being content to have any kind of willful attachment to sin. That's what's pleasing to our Lord. When you're offering the Mass, you have to realize that you are reliving the Passion of Christ. It is Calvary made present again. It's the greatest act of worship the world has ever known or ever will know. The one supreme, eternal act of worship for the Son of God. It's painful to consider the fact that the vast majority of Catholics, even practicing Catholics, seem to have no real idea of what is going on when Mass is being offered. They don't consider the fact that they are seeing our Lord's eternal sacrifice mystically renewed, mystically represented, not repeated, but represented. See, there's a great distinction to be made there. It is an action which transcends time and space and helps us really to place ourselves at the foot of the cross. You know, when the priest is offering Mass, when the people are taking part in the celebration of the Mass, it's important to recall the fact that when the priest consecrates that sacred host, when he consecrates that wine, he always does it separately, never together. And it's important to remember that the separation of the body and the blood is critical. Now, what happens when the blood is poured out from the body? The separation of the body and the blood means death. That's why the Mass is a true sacrifice. That sacrifice, that consecration, that separate consecration of the body and blood of Christ is of its nature a sacrificial act. That's why we say, and the Church has always taught, that the Mass is a true sacrifice.